Welcome everybody. It's an absolute thrill to see that there are so many people attending. One of the great things, there aren't many, that has come out of this pandemic is the ability for us all to zoom into these webinars and actually connect with each other in at least a remote way. So the Global Encounters Project is a 5-year project. I suspect with COVID, it means it will actually go longer than 5 years, but it's a 5-year project looking at the encounters of people coming to Australia and Aboriginal people leaving Australia for the period right up to the British. I'm really, it seems entirely appropriate that we would have someone of Shino Konishi's calibre to kick us off for the first seminar in 2021. I keep saying 2020. But Shino is an affiliate of our program. And in fact, I was so thrilled. I wrote to her asking if she'd like to be involved. And I got an instant reply. It was just such a delight. So big fan of Shino's work, have been for very many years. Shino is based at the Australian Catholic University in the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And today she's going to talk to us about French encounters in New Holland between 1801 and 1826. So over to you, Shino.
Thank you. I'll just roll my PowerPoint. Okay. Right. Well, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Whadjuk Noongar, on whose budja I'm privileged to live and work, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank Nanette and Leonie for their invitation to give this seminar today. In Western Australia, there are currently more than 260 places named after French voyagers, their ships and their patrons, more than any other state in Australia. Alongside numerous commemorative memorials and statues, as well as semi-regular newspaper articles posing the counterfactual, what if we'd been colonised by the French instead, these place names illustrate the legacy of the 5 French expeditions which visited Western Australia over a 55-year period, beginning with St. Aloan in 1771 and ending with Dumontville in 1826. The expeditions, plus another 2, led by Hyacinth de Bougainville and Duperrey, which had been instructed to visit but changed course en route, reveal the particular interest the French took in this region, shaped largely by their desire to discover Terre Australe, or the unknown Southland, a mythologized continent first imagined in antiquity. The French accounts of Western Australia, or Nouvelle Hollande as they called it, precede the British occupation, which began with the garrison at King George Sound in December 1826 and was cemented with the establishment of the Swan River Colony in 1829. This makes the French descriptions of Aboriginal people and their material cultures and practices, which are richer and more detailed than the earlier Dutch accounts, particularly valuable. Admittedly, the French had relatively few encounters with Aboriginal people in Western Australia compared to Tasmania and New South Wales, but for the most part, these encounters seem to take place on Aboriginal terms, with the individuals involved largely initiating and shaping the nature of the encounter. So I'm now going to just describe a number of encounters here in Western Australia. The first French expedition to have any significant interaction with Aboriginal people was led by Nicolas Baudin, whose proposal to conduct an extensive survey of different regions in the South Seas to collect floral and faunal specimens which could foster new economic and commercial interests was pared back to a survey of the still little known Western and Southern New Holland. Departing in October 1800, Baudin's men arrived at a very large bay on the 30th of May 1801, which they named after their ship, the Geographe. A group led by mineralogist Louis Depuche went ashore and soon met an old Aboriginal man who was fishing. The man, perhaps a Wardandi Noongar, was bearded, and completely naked, except for a kangaroo skin over his shoulder. He initially seemed unperturbed by the presence of the French, but when they approached him, he suddenly gathered his spears and proudly stood up to them, launching into a very animated speech, pointing at various times to the ships and apparently making signs for the strangers to return. After he finished his speech, Depuch approached the man, calling Teo, Teo, a term for friend used in the Pacific that the British and French explorers alike had used in different parts of Australia to little effect. He also offered a glass necklace, which seemed to intrigue the old man, although as Depuch got closer, he suddenly ran off with impressive speed. This description of the man's initial nonchalance at the arrival of the strangers, followed by his seeming directive to the French to return to their ship, is reminiscent of other descriptions of first encounters elsewhere in Australia. As Sylvia Hallam and Maria Nugent have suggested, such actions reflect Indigenous protocols for crossing boundaries and entering another's country. As Hallam explains, traditional owners will initially ignore the newcomer, who are expected to wait passively at the border until approached. This approach may be a threatening display, which the newcomer is expected to passively withstand, or a speech explaining whether or not they're welcome to come onto country. As Maria Nugent has argued regarding James Cook's first landing at Botany Bay in Sydney, perhaps the French failed to perform their role in the usual protocol by still approaching the man, the Wardandi man, after he had indicated that they should return to the ship, which brought their meeting to an abrupt close. During the rest of their stay at Geograph Bay, Baudin's crew observed Wardandi Noongar on 2 other occasions. They were unable to convince them to have a prolonged meeting. In June 1801, they headed north, making their way to Shark Bay without any significant encounters with Aboriginal people. One of the 2 expedition artists, Nicolas Martin Petit, drew what appears to be a very realistic, posed portrait of an Aboriginal man, which some have speculated may have been a man from northwestern Australia. This portrait shows a young man with scarification marks and a nasal piercing. Most notably, he appears to have short, straight hair, unlike the curly hair of the Aboriginal people depicted in portraits from Tasmania and Sydney. This has led Peter Spillett to conjecture that he was from the northwest, his straight hair possibly a sign of the repeated interactions between Aboriginal people and Macassan Trepangas who visited the Kimberley to collect sea cucumber since at least the early 18th century. Indeed, the Baudin expedition encountered Macassan praus or fishing boats off Cassini Island near Columbaroo. Unfortunately, this portrait lacks any accompanying narrative, and the man's name and location has not been recorded. But if he is from the northwest, as Spillett suggests, it is Petit's only portrait of a West Australian Aboriginal person. After this stay at Shark Bay, the Baudin expedition sailed for Timor and then on to Tasmania and Port Jackson before returning to Western Australia, arriving at King George's Sound in February 1803. On the 26th of February 1803, midshipman Joseph Ransonnet was exploring a small bay near present-day Shanes when a group of 8 Noongar people, most likely Meneng, appeared to summon him, gesturing and crying out to his boat. As far as the French knew, this was the first time that a European had the opportunity to approach the native people of this region, and Ransonnet crowed that he was, quote, more fortunate than George Vancouver and Bruni d'Entrecasteaux, who had visited the region in 1791 and 1792, respectively, because he was, quote, able to have a long and peaceful meeting with the natives of Newtsland, which had been named after Peter Newts, who had mapped the south coast for the VOC in 1626. As Ransonnet arrived, the Meneng Noongar group split, with the 3 women going away and the 5 men throwing their spears to the side, indicating to the French their peaceful intent. They then helped the Frenchmen to land their boat. Ransonnet and his sailors forgot to take the presents that Baudin normally kept for meeting natives, so they instead improvised gifts, cutting buttons off their coats, taking out their handkerchiefs, and offering their old coats. And the Noongar men appeared to receive these with some satisfaction, though not with any eagerness. They then returned the gifts back to the French, who in turn passed them back again. Ending this continual back and forth of the gifts, the Noongar men finally lay them on the ground, either not realising that they were gifts to keep, or perhaps not wanting to accept them and be obliged to reciprocate in any way. The men had with them some very handsome dingoes, which Ransonnet tried to obtain, but they steadfastly refused to trade, and Ransonnet assumed it was because they were too valuable for hunting kangaroos. This meeting was very friendly, as the French and Noongar men sat down together for a meal. Ransonnet observed how they speared fish, and then offered some of their coffee, biscuit, and salt beef, which they tasted, whilst refusing to try the bacon. During this meeting, Ransonnet observed the men's appearance closely. Describing them as tall, thin, and very agile, he noted that, quote, they have very long hair, black eyebrows, a short flat nose, deep-set eyes, a large mouth, protruding lips, and very beautiful, very white teeth. He noticed that the three oldest men looked to be about 40 to 50 years old, had big black beards and trimmed curly hair. Their skin was covered in ochre and their nasal septum pierced. The two younger men, perhaps 16 to 18 years old, had no scarification marks and wore their hair long, gathered back into a knot and powdered with ochre. The men were all naked, wore no ornaments except for a belt made from strands of kangaroo skin. I think the description of them having ochre is significant because in looking at other encounters across Australia, we sort of notice that when the men are painted up is normally accompanied by more formal interactions. So it suggests to me that they were kind of prepared to meet the French on this occasion. Throughout the meeting, the men talked loudly, singing from time to time, and always accompanied their song with the same gestures. The meeting was marked by good relations, although the Noongar men would not allow the French to venture towards where the women were hiding. They did, however, take one of the sailors to their well to share their water and gave Ransonnet a stone axe. Baudin was delighted to hear of this encounter, noting that, quote, the two parties made themselves understood as well as possible by signs and spent the greater part of the day together on very good terms. I'll now turn to the Freycinet expedition, which next visited Western Australia. Louis de Freycinet had served as an officer on the Baudin expedition, and upon returning to France, had worked with Perron in preparing the official journal for publication. In 1816, Freycinet was commissioned to lead a scientific expedition circumnavigating the globe on the Uranie, with the primary aim of establishing an observatory near Rio de Janeiro. One of their first destinations was Dirk Hartog Island in Shark Bay, where Freycinet was determined to recover the French plate inscribed by Willem de Vlaming in 1697, and the Perron Peninsula, where they carried out their natural history collecting. It was on the Perron Peninsula, on the 15th of September 1818, that Freycinet's men encountered Aboriginal people, perhaps the Mulgana, who's named Shark Bay Gathraguda. The expedition artist, Jacques Arago, like Perron before him, was eager to meet Aboriginal people, confessing his desire to, quote, enrich my atlas with some of those grotesque and curious scenes that excite so much interest and without which such work as mine is dull and fatiguing, end quote. After venturing out on his own and suffering from the heat and lack of water, Arago was relieved to make it back to the French camp and delighted to see that the camp had visitors. Alphonse Pellion had already offered them gifts of bead necklaces, looking glasses, and knives to try and ingratiate the Mulgana men, and they reciprocated by presenting the Frenchmen with clubs and spears. One of the Frenchmen offered a pair of drawers, which they tore to pieces and shared the fragments amongst themselves. Another sailor gave them some bacon in exchange for a club, and they smeared the bacon fat over their bodies. The trade item that they seemed most happy with was a tin plate, which the eldest man kept. All of these exchanges, according to Arago, were made with a certain mistrust on the part of the Aboriginal people. They appeared to watch the Frenchmen as dangerous enemies and were continually pointing to the ships, exclaiming, "Ayakede, Ayakede," which the French interpreted as "go away, go away." Arago observed that the group appeared divided into 3 bands. The boldest had approached the strangers near their camp, another remained on a hill about 1/4 of a mile away, and a third, including women, remained on the summit of a hill high above. Arago was determined to get closer and noticed that many in the group looked towards an older man whose body was painted with ochre and who appeared distinguished from the rest by a shell hanging from his girdle. So Arago turned his attention to him and, like Depush from the Baudin expedition, called out the Polynesian word teo, making friendly gestures and offering his white handkerchief. However, the elder remained unmoved, so Arago pulled out a pair of castanets from his pocket and played a tune by rattling them briskly. Suddenly the old man rose with astonishment and, holding out his spear, began to dance, soon joined by some of the others. Another man beat a rhythm on his spear with 2 clubs. Arago then showed the man his castanets, though was reluctant to trade them, as the old man seemingly desired. As Arago walked away from the elder, the man shouted to the others, and they all left, signalling that they would return the next day. Overnight, Arago worried about their return, thinking that they might come in large numbers and overwhelm the French camp. So he set off the next day with a sailor, armed with a double-barreled gun and a sabre. After an hour, the pair saw a group of men rushing down the hill, shouting loudly, reminiscent... one of the men gave a vehement speech, punctuated with the word ayakede, or go away, and threatening gestures. Arago responded in turn by shouting ayakede at them, which seemed to confuse them. Fearing they might attack, Arago then fired his gun over their heads to alarm them with the noise. The artist was soon joined by Freycinet and others from the camp, and they again tried to offer the Mulgana men some gifts. One of the Frenchmen stripped naked in an attempt to show that they were all the same underneath their clothes, but this mark of courage and confidence led to no result. But the Mulgana men again gave the Frenchmen gifts, including a club, feathers, a 6-foot-long spear, and then walked away, disappearing with astonishing swiftness when the French tried to follow. This meeting differed to previous encounters French explorers had had in Western Australia, as they were deliberately approached rather than seemingly happened upon. The first meeting was by a largish group with an elder painted up, ready to address the strangers, and in this respect was reminiscent to some other cross-cultural encounters between Aboriginal people and explorers elsewhere in Australia. The Mulgana men also offered a range of gifts, though apparently not to establish a reciprocal relationship with the strangers, as was often the case, but instead to oblige the strangers to leave their country, which they did 10 days later. The last French expedition to visit Western Australia was Jules Sébastien César de Monteville's voyage in the Astrolabe, 1826 to 1829, which landed in King George's Sound in October 1826, 2 months before the British established their garrison there. During their stay, they had friendly interactions with Meneng people. On their first day ashore, they saw smoke from a fire, and on approach saw a man wearing an animal skin cloak. The man approached them fairly resolute, but then seemed to have misgivings as he neared. After receiving a gift of bread, he seemed to lose all his suspiciousness and was soon laughing and calling out to his friends. He soon climbed into the French boat, where everyone overwhelmed him with friendliness and loaded him with presents. He happily stayed aboard, where he slept like a baby, and explained that the fires seen ashore had been lit by his people. Strong winds prevented Du Monteville from returning the man to shore, but when they managed it 2 days later, one of his comrades was waiting for him on shore and requested the favour of taking his place. Du Monteville refused this second man's offer, as the wild surf meant he was unsure that he could return the man, back to his country. The next day, different French parties went out exploring and collecting, and each met friendly Meneng men, and Du Monteville reported that all showed a desire to follow him on board. He invited one man who possessed a glowing banksia cone, which he used to keep warm and quickly light fires, and Du Monteville pressured the man to try and trade this item, for the French realised that the Meneng people set fire to the undergrowth and the dry grass as they passed through, which made the New Holland forest so open and easy of access. While the man was aboard the French boat, the Meneng continued to behave peacefully towards the Frenchmen on shore, and even brought 3 children to the camp, which the French interpreted as, quote, infallible proof of their trust in and good intentions towards us, end quote. The women, however, did not approach the French, which Kwa attributed to the presence of English sailors in the area, who were reported to have abducted Aboriginal women and had with them at the time 2 Palawa women from Port Dalrymple. The French seemed impressed with the Meneng man's friendliness, willingness to trade, and their intrepid eagerness to board their boats. Such demeanour foreshadowed the Meneng's initial friendly interactions with the British and their curiosity about maritime voyaging, as Tiffany Shellam's research reveals. So to briefly conclude, the French explorers' legacy is evident in the French place names which remain dotted along our West Australian coastlines. Yet for Aboriginal people, their legacy is also in the rich textual accounts and images of Indigenous material culture that they produced. In the French journals, we see Aboriginal people's different responses to the arrival of European strangers. Some were friendly, such as Ransonnet and Dumonteville's amicable encounters with Meneng men near King George Sound in 1801 and 1826, respectively. Others remained tense and suspicious, such as the encounter between Baudin sailors and the seeming giants of Gathraguda or Shark Bay. Sorry, this is something I've cut from the paper, but I've discussed it in a separate article called The Giants of Shark Bay, something like that. And then other encounters again, such as Arago's meeting with the Mulgana, which were formal and tense, laden with suspicion on both sides, but nonetheless interspersed with a moment of mutual connection, sparked by the beat of the castanet. Thank you.
Thank you, Shino. I've now got the sun coming through my window. I'm going to try and perhaps move just. Sorry, it's that time of day, bad time of day for my office. Okay, I don't think I can do much better than that. Okay, thanks a lot, Shino. That's fantastic. Obviously, I'm hoping people will ask questions, but I've got a couple of little things I'd love to kick off and start with. I just loved your comment that the ochre might indicate that they were prepared to meet, that perhaps they'd been, I mean, I'm reading between the lines here, that perhaps they'd been observing them for some time and they'd prepared and got themselves ready. So it was in a sense a ceremonial activity, the application of the ochre.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I ended up cutting that, more of an explanation of that out. Yeah, that's what I think, because, and it's sort of looking at later overland expeditions, but just kind of seeing this pattern of, you know, some encounters, like Thomas Mitchell's account is really illustrative of this, because he has so many encounters, and the ones where Aboriginal people seem really surprised, you'll notice there's no description of ochre, or whereas then when the expedition will come across them and they'll be sitting there waiting in their path, and you'll see sort of senior men who have ochre and you know, more ceremonial dress, and there's more formalized speech making. And so I did think that there is a kind of, you know, that the explorers are probably being observed, and you know, it probably depends on the country they're in, how easily they're able to be observed. So I think like Sturt, for instance, who's travelling quite lightly, compared to Mitchell, who's got, you know, drays and wagons. I think Sturt is just on horseback, but, you know, he tends to come across and surprise and shock people more often. So I think they don't have that chance to get prepared to formally meet. And so, you know, the French talk about the kind of the lay of the land, and they can see, like in Shark Bay, where that you have these large dunes that the Aboriginal people have a clear vantage point over them and can kind of see them, and there they have these more formal interactions. So yeah, I think it is interesting kind of seeing how prepared the Aboriginal people are for some of these encounters.
Fantastic.
And to trade, yeah.
Thank you. Actually, Mark Coffey's just asked a question. It's actually the next thing I was going to ask about as well, and that was the castanets and the playing of music. And I was immediately taken to Inga Clendenning's idea of people dancing on the beach. And Marg's asked, are you aware of other music making, sort of like music as a mutual way of easing the encounter?
Yeah, so in not in WA, but in Tasmania, again, it's the French. I think it's in D'Entrecasteaux's expedition. I think they play the violin, and people sing, and then I think they try and kind of try different songs to see what the interest is for Aboriginal people. And so I think on that occasion they sort of sing some or try some sort of French romantic kind of songs, and then the Aboriginal people will sort of hum and sing along, and then they try more what they call more rousing renditions of other songs to see how they respond. So yeah, there's other instances where they kind of use music, and it seems to kind of cut through. And Origo then didn't want to give up his castanets, so he kind of quickly sort of tried to end the interaction then. So yes, it's sort of interesting to think about what what objects kind of lead to these kind of common touchstones, and then which ones they're willing to give up and which ones they aren't.
And the beads that you mentioned, I'm assuming these are glass beads, probably coming out of most likely Venice, I'm imagining. Have they been identified or found archaeologically? That's
a really good question. I don't know that actually. Yeah, that'd be a really good thing to investigate.
The other question is, I'm thinking of sorts of things that happen in New Guinea where you get glass beads incorporated into traditional material culture. So they start to use them to decorate, the handles of axes and things like that. So it might be something else we could think about looking at the collections, museum collections. Yeah.
Well, I think the glass and metal is what they seem most interested in. That sort of came up in one of the examples I gave with the metal. And yeah, no, I think that would be interesting to see how they get incorporated later. I mean, and it's also interesting that the French took kind of, trinkets and baubles with to exchange. But yeah, I think often there's probably slightly less interest in these.
I can see we've got two more questions. So I'm going to go over to Leonie, who's going to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Shino. That was fantastic. And I just wanted to say that I've been a fan of your writing for a long time. The first thing I read of yours was Francois Perron and the Tasmanians, An Unrequited Romance, and it has stuck with me. And for anyone who hasn't read it, it's got one of the best first lines ever, which is, Francois Perron was my first. And it's fantastic. But it raises so many interesting ideas about us as readers and as researchers when we approach historical texts and their writers. Like with Perron, you sum up his work so well. One of the quotes is, it's a treasure trove of objectionable quotations. And I've encountered a similar thing reading George Augustus Robinson's writing, where, one minute you're horrified, but then you sort of continue reading and you start to get glimpses of the humanity, and then you're horrified again, and you go through, you know, all these emotional responses as a reader. And I'm sure a lot of the people listening today would be, you know, acquainted with that kind of, you know, the emotional roller coaster that we go through when reading a lot of these sorts of texts of encounters. And yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about that, about the role of emotion in both the texts themselves, but also the way we read them.
Yeah. No, thank you for, yeah, I mean, I think this is something, you know, these are questions I've been sort of thinking about and trying to grapple with. Yeah, because you kind of read the accounts and the, you know, the physical descriptions can be very confronting and you know, very alienating. But then at the same time, the accounts can have quite rich description of Indigenous agency. So it's kind of reading past those sort of affronting and, you know, sometimes denigratory descriptions to then kind of seeing, you know, trying to see through their eyes what Indigenous people are doing. And then it's so, and, you know, I think it's through doing that you start to get an appreciation of them. You know, think, okay, well, these accounts, they're valuable. The descriptions they've given are kind of opening up a new window and starts to give you a different sense of the writer as well. And, you know, if you start to empathise with kind of everything they're going through, and I think the French are kind of more inclined to admit the, you know, the physical and emotional torments of exploration. You know, they're always getting lost. They're always, they don't have enough water. You know, those that are, I mean, you know, they're trying to recover and find people who've been lost. So, yeah, I think they kind of have that sense of vulnerability, which, you know, again, is kind of, means I read them a bit more sympathetically, despite the, you know, at times quite offensive descriptions of Aboriginal people. So, so yeah, so I think it's kind of trying to, you know, that just in some of these richer accounts, you can kind of get a sense of, and, you know, it's also looking at, you know, trying to imagine the places they're in, how they're experiencing it, just to get those deeper insights into their emotional responses and how that is shaping what they think. And I can just explain a bit further. I think Bronwyn Douglas has a sort of, you know, with her idea of Indigenous countersigns, I think is really useful, because she says when you read these denigratory descriptions, that itself is a sign of Indigenous agency. It's where Indigenous people have made them feel, you know, uncomfortable or vulnerable, and kind of, you know, incited them to write these kind of denigratory descriptions. You know, that the descriptions themselves aren't factual, but, you know, they're value laden and an emotional response to what Indigenous people are doing, as opposed to how they're appearing.
Another question, I might just move us along a little bit. Daniel Feldman's asked Shino, did the French encounter any British explorers during that period? And if so, how did they interact with each other?
Well, yes, so they're encountering them in different ways. So I guess textually, they're all very aware of Dampier's accounts. And so Dampier, you know, even though this is in English, they're writing in French. You'll see them using the same quote about Aboriginal people as the miserablest people in the world. You know, so they're really demonstrating that influence of Dampier. And then for the later explorers, they're aware of Cook's writings and sort of responding to those. So there's that awareness and engagement with each other's writing. And then the Baudin encountered Flinders in South Australia. So so their meeting has been, or, you know, a few people have discussed that, including John West-Suby and Jean Fonaciero, and Peter Monteith, sorry, in their book, which is called The Encounter. But also Baudin, like in this, they see English in Tasmania. They have this kind of funny account of where their ship's sailing by and they see someone kind of come racing out with a you know, Union Jack flag to kind of quickly try and plant it. And Baudin sort of, you know, facetiously comments about, you know, how can they think that just planting a flag means that it's theirs? Or, you know, that kind of questioning these sort of symbols of possession, you know, as being pretty trivial and silly. And then, of course, you know, saying, you know, that there are people already there, meaning Aboriginal people. So, so there's that account. And then Dumont d'Urville does meet English sealers in King George Sound. So this is before the British established a garrison there, and they've come across from Tasmania. And so, yeah, he sort of talks to them about what they find, and they have with them 5 Aboriginal people, including 2 women from Tasmania. So, so the French talk to those women and write down some Palawa words that they learn from the women. So, so yeah, so there kind of are a few interactions with the British as well.
Thank you. I was wondering, we don't have another question, so I'm going to take the liberty of asking you to maybe explore something a little bit. Your wonderful paper, The Giants of Shark Bay, and I can't remember if that's the actual title or not.
I can't remember.
Because I'm gathering you've cut quite a bit of that out of today's talk. So if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that, give us a little bit of a précis. I'm particularly interested in how that kind of imaginary sense of Australia as a place of oddity, you know, but in potentially a place where we would have had giants, you know, or you know, the literal antipodes. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, I did kind of have a section and thought I better cut it out to keep the paper as short. So yeah, so that's really interesting. So it's when they're about to, the Baudin expedition is about to leave Australia, and so they quickly return to Shark Bay because they know there's lots of turtle there, that they can easily collect turtle to salt, and you know, that will last them for the journey home. And so while they're there, they aren't expecting to do any kind of you know, natural history exploring or collecting, and they send the fishermen ashore, and then suddenly they hear them kind of screaming out, and you know, that there are these, you know, 100 giants kind of storming the beach towards them. And they do kind of laugh this off, but then a second group also comes back terrified, you know, claiming that there are these giants, you know, with huge spears and shields kind of roaring towards them. And so then Baudin thinks, well, they should investigate this. And Perron sort of remembers Dutch accounts, because again, you know, they've read the Dutch voyages as well. So I think Willem de Vlaming's account from 1697 was translated into French. And in that, they talk about finding these giant footprints, and they believe they'd seen a giant footprint as well. So he starts to think, oh, it's pretty unlikely, and it's, you know, sort of silly sailors thinking they saw giants, but there is this possibility because of Dutch accounts and other evidence that it might be true. So they do send an expedition to go ashore and look for these so-called giants. And then when they do meet a group the next day, you know, they say that the sized and there's only a small group, not 100, but they do then have this sort of interesting interaction where, you know, they feel vulnerable, but they try to bluff feeling confident, So again, it's a sort of interesting thing about how, you know, they're kind of improvising during these encounters, and after they sort of try and bluff, feeling very confident and assertive and not appearing to cower, you know, in the presence of a sort of a larger group of Aboriginal, possibly Mulgana men, they, you know, the group then just quickly decide to leave and, you know, just turn their back on them and go. And they have no kind of curiosity about who these Frenchmen are. You know, that they don't try and tell them, you know, to go away or anything like that. They just seem indifferent and pass and turn away from them, which is kind of disconcerting for the French. So yeah, it's a really interesting encounter that's hard to read.
So I've got a question from Eva Bischoff in Trier in Germany. I'm guessing it's horribly early in the morning. Eva, thank you for coming along online. So Eva said, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. If I've understood you correctly, French reports show that Aboriginal people from the northwestern coast interacted differently with the French explorers than those in the south. Could you elaborate that a little bit, please?
Yes. Well, I think the really friendly encounters that the French had, so 2 different expeditions, 25 years apart, were both at King George Sound in the south, you know, probably with Meneng Noongar people or men. They didn't meet women. And they were very friendly, and, you know, they kind of elicited the encounters, and, you know, that's where they happily went on the boat for de Monteville. So yeah, they seem very open to meeting with strangers, whereas in Shark Bay, that, you know, there's that sort of more suspicion and sort of more formal protocols of how to sort of say, okay, we acknowledge you're here, but you should go now. You know, here are the, you know, here are our gifts, you can go. And there just isn't that friendliness. You know, I didn't describe it in Dumont Deville, but there's also long accounts of, you know, the Meneng are really interested in touching their bodies, lifting their clothes, kind of marveling at, you know, the French think marveling at their sort of robust legs. But, you know, sort of that, yeah, there's a lot of intimacy in those interactions and curiosity, which is lacking in the northern ones. So I think there are just different protocols and different cultures and ways of engagement. And this would really come out in Tiffany Shellam's work and her book Meeting the Walo, which includes Meneng intermediaries who travel with the British up north, and the Meneng and Noongar have their own kind of histories and myths about northern Aboriginal people who they call the Walo, which is sort of, you know, they're within Noongar stories, the Walo are more fierce. And so, yeah, I think there are definitely, you know, across Australia, different, you know, different cultures of meeting strangers.
Now, I've got a question here from Fikri, who is based in Makassar. Hello, Fikri, and I'm hoping you're feeling much better. I have a question about the duration of the encounters. I was wondering why they were only happening for 25 years. What happened? What stopped these friendly encounters?
Well, I think well, I guess these expeditions, you know, I was just sort of looking at these French scientific expeditions. So that's sort of, I guess, how long they go for. You know, they're very expensive. I guess as, you know, after the British kind of claim more and more parts of Australia, I suppose it becomes more politically difficult to undertake. And yeah, and I guess, you know, sort of new areas open up where they want to explore. So I think it's more, you know, the nature of the expeditions kind of limits it to this period, not the nature of interactions with Aboriginal people or ideas about Aboriginal people.
Sure. I'm going to go back to a question about material culture. you made a remark that one of the things people were one of the things they were very interested in was steel. And that's metal. And that's certainly the same. So we're picking this up all over the place. It's surely indicative that people are already familiar with what steel is, because people arrive and that they think it's a first contact situation, but people immediately ask for steel. You know, in the Torres Straits, they want steel, certainly up in Arnhem Land and across the Gulf of Carpentaria. Steel is one of the things they request. Is that your impression as well, that they knew what they wanted?
Yeah, that's really, I suppose it's yeah, I haven't really thought of that question, and I guess my instinct is that in these early accounts, it's a little bit harder to tell. I mean, I guess it's thinking what is kind of sort of seems intrinsically valuable and recognisably valuable about steel and metal. It could be the sort of shininess. You know, I guess I'm thinking about the appeal of pearl shell and other sort of iridescent, shiny objects might translate to, you know, an aesthetic appeal for metal. I mean, in Tasmania and in New South Wales, the French comment that there's a lot of interest in red cloth.
Oh yes.
So
yeah, we get that.
Yeah, so that must have a sort of a ceremonial, symbolic significance.
And I think it's so similar in ochre to the colour of ochre.
Yeah.
But certainly the Dutch actually say, you know, in a couple of accounts they say they want steel because what they can do with a steel axe, you know, making their canoes or whatever, is so much easier with a steel axe than a stone axe, which is not entirely true, but that's the impression that they're being given, that they want them to use them. It's sort of rather than a decorative.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the overland expeditions later, yeah, they're definitely always wanting steel axes and hatchets and you know, kind of asking for them and, you know, seeming disappointed with other things, you know, holding out for the hatchets. And indeed, a lot of overland explorers take hatchets as their, you know, new form of beads.
Yes.
So I guess there's a recognition from the British that, you know, this is the new desirable trade item.
So that lovely description when the Overland Telegraph goes in and people are going up the poles and taking the glass insulators, that what they start doing is they start leaving caches of bottles around the base of the poles, because hoping that they will prefer to take the bottles rather than climb up and take the insulators.
Yeah. Ah, that's interesting.
So I've seen archaeologically, you know, flaked insulators and flaked glass. So.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I guess the hardness of metal would be, you know, immediately apparent. And I mean, Dumont de Ville, he trades an axe or a hatchet. Sorry, they receive a Menang hatchet, and you know, he remarks how, you know, it's got a stone head attached by resin, but he's amazed that the resin is so incredibly hard. It's like stone itself, and comment, you know, he really appreciates the kind of hardness of their stone hatchets. And so, you know, I guess I'm now thinking, well, you know, then, you know, if their own tools can be incredibly hard, then maybe they're immediately recognizing metal as incredibly hard and valuable.
Yeah. David's asked a question here. We've got a comment from Jacinta Walsh. Jack's saying, thank you, Shino, that's been very interesting. So thank you. And David's asked, do we have any theories on why the bacon was refused?
Yes. Yes, I suspect it's the smell of the bacon, because in somewhere else, I can't remember exactly, probably in Tasmania, I think, where they offer them bacon, and you know, they actually describe in that encounter them, you know, touching it, refusing to taste it, but then sort of smelling their hands afterwards. And you know, and then I think they described watching, you know, two Aboriginal people then, you know, sort of indicating that they're sniffing their fingers and talking to each other with disgust. So it must be the smell of it that they don't like. Although they use it for a, you know, because a lot of places they'll smear fat on their skin, you know, as a, you know, to protect their skin. And so, yeah, I think they sort of use it for that. So maybe, yeah, the idea of eating it, you know, something fatty that you would smear on your body instead is repugnant.
There's a lovely, I'm pretty sure it's in Flinders, there's a lovely bit where he encounters, I think it's around Green Cape, somewhere like that, and he encounters, I guess towards Eden, and he encounters an Aboriginal man, just a single lone man on the beach, and he describes it as shark fat tucked into his belt, and he offers him a ship's biscuit, and the man offers, I'm pretty sure it's Flinders, some shark fat, but then they both turn and spit it out.
Oh,
We both find it revolting.
yeah.
But I think that the mediation of, we've already talked about the mediation of music, but potentially the mediation of food as well as a, you know, a mechanism for communicating is something really worth thinking about. So yeah.
I mean, Europeans are always, or these explorers, they're always so keen to try and get Aboriginal people to drink alcohol, you know, to drink rum and beer. And I mean, Dumont Deville, he talks about that the man who came aboard their boat for two nights, you know, that they gave him alcohol, which he didn't like, or brandy, which he didn't like. And then, so when they return him to shore, you know, they can tell he's telling, you know, he must have told them not to, you know, not to try the brandy at all, because afterwards all the others will refuse. So yeah, so it's, you know, it's interesting what they're kind of quickly learning about each other, and you know, that the French can learn what, or start to get some impressions of what Aboriginal people think about them and are telling others about the French.
So we've just got couple of, I'll go with one comment, and then there's one last question I'm hoping you can do very quickly. Leonie made the comment that it's such a sense of physical intimacy in the French accounts, sniffing, examining the bodies, sampling the food, and I'll take that as a comment. And Margaret Coffey has asked, just curious, has there been any work recovering language and vocabulary that connects what the French thought was being said to them and what it actually was?
Oh, that's a really good. I don't know. I imagine there must be, because the French have got word lists. So I imagine that linguists have, you know, done things with those word lists. I mean, I guess looking at them, it's, you know, you sort of have to read them with a, you know, with the French, you know, thinking about it's French ears that recorded these words. Yeah, I think, I mean, I've sort of just commented on the, you know, the types of words they recorded and how they're kind of always physical, tangible, you know, like body parts feature heavily, because I guess it's easy to point and touch, and, you know, you can be fairly sure that, you know, the word is correct. But yeah, I don't know about, you know, a more sort of sophisticated study. I think, yeah, I'd have to talk to some linguists about that.
Well, that really does take us right through. This has been fantastic, Shino. Apart from the fact that I'm having to get further down the screen to keep the sun out of my eyes, absolutely wonderful. What a wonderful way to kick off our monthly seminar series. I'm deeply grateful to you for agreeing to do this. So we've got a few thanks are coming up down the bottom as well. Lots of people saying thank you, fascinating, just great. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much.
This will be it will be available as a recording once we've set ourselves up in the way that we're going to have these as sort of podcasts. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.